Today we're going to talk to you about a project that we've been doing for a couple of years at Lucy Parsons Labs, which is a 501c3 nonprofit that does police accountability journalism and digital security. I'm Jen.
And I'm Camille.
But first, we want to take a little bit of time to make a comment about some of the events that occurred yesterday. So I don't know if everyone saw this statement was published, signed by a bunch of organizations and individuals, including Lucy Parsons Labs.
On a personal note, I seriously considered not giving the session today. I don't think that, in general, I don't think people should speak at conferences that protect and enable fascists, cops, and rapists and bring them into their spaces. I ended up deciding to try and use this part of this time in this platform to speak about my work, but also to acknowledge what happened yesterday. I'm not totally sure what the right thing to do in this situation is, whether that's speaking or not. And if you have thoughts about that, I'd love to connect with you one-on-one sometime perhaps after the session. Several people throughout yesterday reported incidents of harassment by right-wingers to Hope Security, and these kinds of things included fascists yelling in people's faces and waiting by the elevators to target individuals. Hope organizers have failed to take these complaints seriously, even in some circumstances, saying that these were not sufficiently targeted threats. Hope has failed to take action and has created a space where that is safe for fascists and not for the people who are speaking and who are vulnerable.
So we decide what community we want to have, and I think most people here, including us, would disagree with these statements that were made by at least one person at Hope Security about extremist right-wing symbols, and we should all decide about what we want the Hope Conference to represent going forward.
I'd also encourage you to check out the Medium statement that was recently written and add your name or your organization if you feel comfortable.
Okay, so now we're going to talk about the project. And first, we're going to motivate why we started working on this. So I'm going to tell a story of someone that we met a couple of years ago. So 2 years ago in Chicago, we met an individual that had been assaulted by a police officer at a protest. And this person tried to go to the police department and file a police complaint against this officer and was told that without the name or the badge number, the complaint will basically just get immediately thrown away. But the person did say this to us, this is pretty much a direct quote, if I ever saw their face again, I would recognize them. Is there anything that you can do? And so this project is to try to have a good answer to that question.
The story that we just told about someone who was assaulted by a police officer, you've probably heard countless stories like it. I personally, at protests I've attended, I've seen people beaten by the cops and pepper sprayed. Police regularly abuse their power, and accountability is oftentimes sparse. You probably heard similar incidents of police using lethal force against people who did nothing wrong. And who are these law enforcement officers? We pay for them with our tax dollars. They are increasingly militarized. They have increasingly powerful weapons that civilians don't have access to. And despite these vast, powerful capabilities, there's very few accountability mechanisms, and this oftentimes translates into influence in courtrooms, for example, where their testimony is considered more credible, more reliable than that of private citizens.
So first, what mechanisms for accountability exist? So we're going to go through a few. Some are more effective than others. So the first is self-policing. For example, each police department, getting some laughs in the audience, each police department does have an internal affairs unit, maybe that's not the right term, and they will investigate within the department and handle things internally and take whatever action is necessary, whether that's suspending an officer or sending that officer for additional training. That's not always effective, and so there's also a police complaints process that may funnel complaints maybe to the department directly or maybe to a civilian oversight agency. The story I told at the beginning about this individual, when we looked into it, there were widespread issues. It wasn't just a kind of rare event. The complaints process in Chicago where that event happened, it basically works as follows. An incident occurs and then the person goes to a police department to register the complaint. Then they have to sign an affidavit. And this affidavit, if they misremember something or misrepresent something, they can be charged with a felony. And so that does discourage a lot of people from filing complaints. Then the investigators need to find the officer in question. If the name and badge number is given, it's easier to do so, but many complaints are thrown out. When we looked into this using data from a nonprofit called Invisible Institute that's acquired a lot of police complaints data, this is a pretty widespread issue. In a 4-year period, a quarter or over a quarter of the complaints were thrown away, which corresponds to thousands of incidents of police misconduct that were not addressed in any way. And there are similar problems in other cities. So civilian oversight agencies exist to try to be an independent check on police power. But in many cases, unfortunately, these agencies struggle to maintain their independence. And this is a recent story from Baltimore where they're trying to reform the police accountability process within a civilian oversight agency. These agencies are unfortunately often underfunded and understaffed, and some, like in Baltimore, lack full investigatory and subpoena powers. And so it makes them really hard to actually do their work. There is also in the United States the Department of Justice, which does have the power to investigate local law enforcement via pattern and practice investigations, which will determine if there are widespread problems within the department. For example, if there's a practice of racially biased policing, or if there's a widespread practice of the unnecessary use of force. And these investigations result in court-enforceable reform agreements that are called consent decrees. And they specify the changes that departments need to make to address the issues that were uncovered in the investigation. And Chicago actually did recently have a Department of Justice investigation, and the report is available, the initial report is available for people to read. And the Department of Justice did find in the case of Chicago, and often find when they do investigate police departments, that it's not just a few bad apples, although you know what they say about a few bad apples. There are widespread problems within the department. So in this case, they found that the use of force, including shooting people, occurs without justification, and sometimes even in a contradiction to policy. So unfortunately, the landscape has changed significantly. The Obama administration did push the Department of Justice investigatory process with respect to local law enforcement. But Jeff Sessions, who's the Attorney General of the Trump Department of Justice, has been a long-time opponent of the use of consent decrees and believes that they are an overstepping of federal powers, and has even called them, I think, quote, dangerous. So we can't really rely on this institution, on these institutions to self-police, and we can't rely on them to kind of ride in and save the day. There are two other tactics that have been effective in some cases, and that is the use of campaigning, building a public campaign, and journalism. And that the goal there is to put public pressure on the police department, the city, and prosecutors to hold law enforcement accountable. In Chicago, there was actually a famous case of a police officer, John Burge, and he's a former police commander who, over a period of more than 2 decades, systematically tortured black men in the city into giving false confessions. So after they were tortured, they were then put in prison, and in some cases on death row for crimes that they didn't commit. And this happened for decades without anything really happening. But after a long public campaign, thanks to the work of dedicated community organizers and grassroots activists, the city agreed to provide reparations to the victims of torture. So that's really an amazing victory. And John Burge was charged and removed.
So if you get a bad haircut, you can leave a Yelp review about that, and make that person's, for example, the bad experience that you had at a business. There's lots of different accountability mechanisms for situations like that. For example, you see a Yelp review in front of you as someone who had a bad experience with a medical professional. But unfortunately, the same doesn't really exist for government agencies. The Federal Trade Commission, for example, you can submit a FOIA request, a Freedom of Information Act request, to the Federal Trade Commission for all consumer complaints that were made against a specific company. For example, the one you see in front of you here is a request that was made on a government transparency website, Muckrock, to 23andMe, which provides ancestry information based on genetic information. And that doesn't really exist for government agencies. So I also want to acknowledge that when we started this project, it was originally intended to address the problems with the complaint filing process in Chicago, but accountability and justice look really, really different for everyone, and people want different things. Resolution can look different for everyone. For example, after some people have negative interactions with law enforcement, for some people, closure might look like getting that officer fired from the force, maybe suspended. Some people might want that officer to go through some sort of training to make sure that something like that never happens again. Other people might consider financial reparations and consider bringing legal charges against either the department or the officer himself. In many situations, people just want to share their stories and make sure that their community is aware of what happened to them. And even when, in some situations, and when police complaints actually end up in trial, for example, gag orders are placed on the survivors, so they actually can't oftentimes talk to the press about what happened, and the waiting of resolution in a trial situation becomes part of the punishment itself. So we hope that this project will assist a wide variety of accountability mechanisms.
So hopefully we've established that, like all powerful people, law enforcement should also have a robust accountability mechanism. So now we want to talk a little bit about police use of surveillance. So there's a really great site on the EFF page called Street Level Surveillance, which describes the different tools that are currently used by law enforcement. So if you're not familiar with some of them, I highly recommend you check that out. Briefly, those tools are automatic license plate readers, which are cameras that are mounted on vehicles or in a stationary location, and they do OCR on license plates, log the plate and the location of the vehicle. There's also body-worn cameras and CCTVs, and those are motivated by the argument that when you're in public, you have no expectation of privacy, something that we'll talk about later. There are also cell site simulators, which are fake cell towers, and the use of facial recognition, which can be integrated into body-worn cameras and CCTV systems, and the extent to which that is done varies city by city. And finally, there are drones. And a lot of that data is organized in fusion centers, which facilitates collaboration by law enforcement agencies on multiple levels.
So a wide variety of information is being gathered by the police on everyday citizens, and oftentimes this information is being misused by the police. So you see a few examples of that in front of you. A few years ago, the NYPD drove a car equipped with an ALPR, an automated license plate reader, and drove it along a street around a mosque, and recorded the license plate of every single car that was parked outside of a mosque, for example. I also just want to mention that poor people, for example, are over-surveilled, right? And they have to reveal a great deal of personal and identifying information about themselves when they apply for food stamps and things like that, or apply for housing, and that information is, in some situations, shared with the police. It's oftentimes, this information is used in a targeted way, and it's often people of color, activists, and religious minorities who bear the burden of this surveillance.
So as a community that we often organize against police surveillance, and like our own organization, Lucy Parsons Labs, has done a lot of work at exposing what police are doing to surveil the public. Armed with that and the knowledge that this accountability process needs some additional assistance, that brings us to OpenOversight. And so the purpose of this transparency and accountability is just when it comes to a police officer's public-facing duties. So we've really scoped the project just to collecting only information that's relevant to their function as a police officer that's interacting with the public. So inspired by all these great tools for surveillance, we've got to get in on the game. And the first thing we need to do is start amassing individual level data on police. So that's actually a little bit difficult, so on first inspection. Most people are aware that most cities, at least big cities, have these open data portals where there's usually quite a lot of data about criminal justice and policing. but it's rare that that information is linked to individual police officers. So I was looking at the City of Berkeley's API for police department arrests, and there's very fine-grained information available on arrestees, like their full name, very precise information about their selves, and their weight, their age, height, etc. That's all available for anyone to download, but none of that is linked to individual officers.
So what information can we get? There's a few different tools available to the public to get individual level police officer data. We use FOIA to get the rosters of police departments in cities that we are implementing into OpenOversight. This is an example of one of those requests. So you might know that some jurisdictions require some information to be made affirmatively publicly available. In California, Transparent California, you might have heard of, you can view the salary and name of each public official or public employee in California. In New York, you can get, and just in New York City specifically, you can get the name of the names and salaries, including overtime pay of all public employees in New York City, including NYPD. But this doesn't include a lot of the information that we want. For example, I found it pretty surprising when we started this project that you actually have to file a FOIA request to even get just a list of the officers in your city that includes badge numbers. That isn't even required to be disclosed by police officers. So generally, this is the type of information that we request. In some situations, we're more successful than others in getting all of that, and some consider some of this information, like gender and race, to be exempt from disclosure. So here's what we have so far. So we started in Chicago, and we have this information on individual level officers in Chicago. Berkeley, for example, considered gender, race, and age to be so they considered gender and race to be exempt from disclosure. You might know under FOIA, agencies are not required to create new records for you, so they claimed that they didn't have a roster that listed age and the date that they joined the force. So with New York, we're just now expanding to NYPD, and we have the names of the officers from Open Data NYC, but we don't have any of the other information yet because our FOIA request is still in process, so we hope to get that soon.
So in addition to individual level data on demographics and duty, we also have officer images. And we can get those from two places. One is submissions from the public, and we've had people submit over 1,000 photos to us, and by scraping social media. So another police surveillance tool is social media surveillance. And since police often will post photographs of officers helping the community, then we can go and scrape all those photos. So we have, we wrote a script to just do that in an automated way on the police department accounts associated with every city that we're interested in. We download all the photos, and we dump them into a database, and we'll talk about how we verify and sort through those photos in a bit. The requirements for those photos are, first, we're restricting it only to officers that are in their uniform in public. And that's because, police are not supposed to be a secret police force, and they have their name and badge number on the uniform for a reason. And so we're kind of scoping it just to that. And it's in public because, again, there's no expectation of privacy in a public space. And then their face needs to be clearly in the photograph along with the name and badge, such that a volunteer can verify it and be like, indeed, Officer Bob, badge number 123, is associated with this face. The other data that is available in public on individual level cops are media stories if there's been an incident, either negative or positive, associated with an officer. A lot of cop watch groups will post their footage to YouTube, and that is something that we can link out to. Lawsuits that individually name cops, those can also be linked to officers, obviously. And then incidents. So we'll talk about how hard it is to get incidents from the department. But there are police accountability groups that for decades have been privately collecting incidents data. So they go